So, hello everybody. My name is Kent Bai, and thank you so much for being here. This is the IEEE XR Ethics. It's a global initiative. It's an industry connection group where for the next 2 years is what we have as our remit. But over the next 6 months or so, I'm hoping that we could start to quickly iterate on creating what's essentially a white paper about XR ethics. So this is a topic which I've been looking at on the Voices of VR. I've recorded about 1,500 oral history interviews, and just since 2016 have been tracking the issue of XR ethics. Has been something that has been emergent within the community. And the challenge, I'd say, this is something that Thomas Metzinger has said, is that there's a pacing gap, meaning that the technology is moving so quickly that our conceptual frameworks for understanding it to be able to both have ethical design, but also the technology policy is not keeping up. So this gap, the faster the technology progresses, the more that we have to come together. And I think this is what this group is. It's the academia and industry and other people from policymakers coming together and say, hey, let's do an assessment of what the landscape of the ethical and moral dilemmas are within XR. Let's consolidate that within a white paper, and then that white paper will be feeding into further policy recommendations. So just a little bit more context is my own journey in this topic. First, to just kind of talk about a little bit of a brief glimpse of the landscape, because you have biometric data that is going to be all sorts of EEG, ECG, EMG, your eye tracking data, galvanic skin response. All of this information is going to be fed into XR. What happens to that? There's volumetric privacy is going to be a concern. We have private property. Can you consent? Like the Holocaust Museum in Pokemon Go was an issue that came up. So that's an ethical issue that fits in here. We have virtual violence and the impact of virtual violence. We have the capability of healing from PTSD, but also potentially causing PTSD as well. Virtual harassment is a big issue. Algorithmic bias, which is something that's focused on AI, but certainly relevant here to these virtual worlds. And accessibility. So this is just a brief look at some of that, and I'll be diving into more of a comprehensive look at that landscape. But first, I wanted to further track my evolution as I was talking about these issues. At the Laval Virtual in 2019, there was a think tank that I participated in. One of the issues that we focused in on was XR ethics. We did this big brainstorm, and to a certain degree, we'll be replicating this process here through whatever technology platform we end up having. I've done some initial surveying of the landscape, but there's always stuff that I didn't have, and it's just that's why you all are here, because you may have specific puzzle pieces into concerns that need to be included within this overall process. But once you sort of brainstorm, then it's like, how do you organize it? And that's been a part of my work, has been trying to break these up into these different domains of human experience, or also could be considered contexts, which we'll be diving in here. So at Laval Virtual, we ended up producing this as our artifact, but this was our initial take. There's obviously way more stuff that we didn't include in this initial take. And so this catalyzed me into like a 9-month process of digging into this more. I went to Augmented World Expo, gave a talk about the ethical and moral dilemmas of mixed reality. Then October of 2019, I gave this XR Ethics Manifesto. And then a lot of this talk that I'll be going through, we'll be just giving a brief overview of that. And the intention is to say, this is just the way that I'm kind of breaking up these issues. So I wanted to start with Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory. There's like 4 major dials you can turn to shift culture. In this case, we're talking about XR and XR technologies. There's the market dynamics. There's the underlying technological and architecture of the code of the technology. There's the culture, and then there's the law of the policy. All 4 of these things are happening at the same time, and they're interfacing in different ways. And you can kind of think about what we're doing here is that we're producing an XR ethics white paper. So we are the culture, we're the academics, we're industry. We're coming together to produce an educational piece of this white paper. And that white paper will hopefully help inform the rest of the industry as they start to design their architectures and their code so that it's done in an ethical way. And then eventually from this white paper, we're going to be coming up with policy recommendations to feed into the government so that if there are specific regulations that need to happen, then that will be essentially our second phase after we do this first 6-month process of the white paper. Okay, so this is the basic proposed timeline, and it'll really depend on who's participating and if we get momentum and what all the steps are on the way. But roughly, we have from about 4 weeks from now, I'm proposing the first step is to get together and present some talks and symposium. It'll be a little bit of a brainstorming process, and people will step up in these different domains and say, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about this. And then based upon how we break up into subcommittees and groups, that will determine those chapters and how those talks break out. And then like basically 8 weeks after that, the end of April, we'll have a first draft. Then we'll have like a 4-week process of getting feedback and then integrating that feedback and then producing a second draft. And then finally, about 6 months from now or so, we'll have a final white paper. So the end of July. That's sort of like, if all goes well and we continue to move forward, this is what I hope that we'll be able to do with this process. And it really depends on everybody that's here jumping in and participating and chipping in whatever way that you can. So context is a big aspect here. This is how I'm breaking up. And this not meant to sort of do a deep dive, but just to say like Helen Niesenbaum's Privacy and Context, a lot of privacy has a contextual dimension. Identity also has a contextual dimension. If you do a search for XR ethics, you'll come up with Michael Madry's and Thomas Meckenzer's piece, Rural Virtual Reality, A Code of Ethical Conduct. And there's a whole section here about how important context is in XR and these environments. And so a lot of what I'll be presenting here is my taxonomy of these different contexts. So just to think about the difference between AR and VR when it comes to context, when you go into VR, you're in an existing context, but you're switching into a completely new context. In AR, you're in a center of gravity of whatever your existing context is, and you're overlaying different layers of context on top of that, but you're not really completely shifting. You're still in that center of gravity of that context. There's lots of different ranges of context from our identity, economy, our values, language, education. Basically, as you start to come up with all these different dimensions of context, I start to map these out into, okay, what's the public, what's private contexts, what are different dimensions of yourself and other. So these are 2 axes to map these out. And one of the things that I had done is just go through a lot of these different papers and then just do a survey of all the different aspects and issues that come up. And this brainstorming process will be taking something like this and having sticky notes and then basically trying to construct from talks and then eventually the white paper. There's been some existing work, but it's not complete. There's gaps here. You can see it's not comprehensive. And so some of these pioneering pieces, they do a great job of doing the initial groundwork, but there's more research that's done since this came out in 2016. And everybody here is going to have specific expertise that they want to potentially contribute to that. And then there's the whole AI, ethically aligned design. You could do a similar thing of say, well, there's actually similar insights that we can get from these other papers that IEEE has produced. I should say that it's sort of unknown as to whether or not we're going to end up using this taxonomy of these different contexts for how we end up structuring the white paper. Again, that'll really be up to the community. I'm proposing like this is one proposed structure, but if it ends up being like, hey, we should focus on agency and embodiment and these other things that are across all of these different contexts, like there's general principles that'll be universal to every context. And so there'll be universal principles, but also like as we dive into each context. So ultimately, I think it would be helpful to say, if you're in education, here's some ethical principles you should follow. Or if you're in medicine, here's the ethical principles. And a part of this process is to bring all of those contexts together to learn from each other, to say what's the universal aspects that we need to know about our perception across all these contexts. And there may be things that are unique to those contexts, and we can decide what the outputs are eventually. But to start off, we're going to do like an initial survey, and whether or not another iteration is to kind of like really do a deep dive and to say, there's a lot of stuff here. It's like really overwhelming. And if you're only focused on this specific industry vertical, then here's a very niche condensed version of what you need to know. So that's another potential outcome. But I think the first draft is just going to be trying to be a one-stop shop where we are having all this different information that's coming together. So this is sort of the taxonomy I'm proposing. Like, I'm going to be walking through each of these just to give you a bit of a flavor. And I think part of the intention here is that as you're listening, you could say, oh, hey, I have something to say about that. Or, maybe that's a group that I want to join in. Maybe there'll be some of these that there's not a critical mass that merits a whole chapter. And maybe they get combined. Or often as I read through some of these contexts end up getting blurred together. Usually as I read through a lot of these different areas are represented. So I'll just quickly walk through each of these, and we'll get into the next steps here at the end. So the first one is biometric data, identity. This is the big part of virtual reality, is that it's modulating your perceptual senses and what's that mean for your identity and all this biometric data. So you have your identity expression and avatar representations. You have the biometric data that's coming off of your body. You have the ability to hack your consciousness and to start to substitute different senses. You have self-sovereign identity. And in my XR Ethics Manifesto, I sort of go through, that's a whole half-hour talk where I list each of these different issues. I don't know if I'll be comprehensively covering all of these, but when I look through like Michael Madry and Thomas Metzinger's piece, the majority of that piece is a lot of that research that would be in this section here. So this is a good chance to kind of do a survey of some of the core affordances of VR. Okay, then we have like resources, money, values. So this gets into stuff like economies and what's the business model and the differences between open versus closed wall gardens and some of those different dynamics from an economic sense. If you deal with money, you have to deal with anti-laundering laws and the different ethics around currency exchange. So you have the potential for virtual gift economies. Probably one of the biggest issues is the surveillance capitalism and the business models. Do we own our data? What can we do with our data? What can other people do with that data to be able to undermine our agency? Is surveillance capitalism a business model that we want to move forward with? Obviously, there's going to be lots of different companies that are involved here. They may have a number of different viewpoints on that. So this will be an opportunity for what is the take on this? Are there different ethical dimensions of this that should be considered in terms of the data that are available and how that is monetized? Okay, so we have early education and communication. So FERPA laws, what is the ethical implications for youth using virtual reality, but also different dimensions of telepresence, data visualization, spatial language and metaphoric language, private communications, and how much of our data that are being tracked about who we're talking to. So then you have home and family, private property. So you have the people that you're connected to, your home and your family. And then when you start to do volumetric scans of your home, then what's that mean when you could be actually violating the privacy of your family members or spatially doxing yourself and revealing your location? And to what degree do property rights relate to the right to be able to consent? So you have, like I mentioned earlier, the Holocaust Museum example. Augmented reality comes into a lot of play here. You could start to look at histories and our memories and memory holding and to what degree that we have the ecological impact, the relationship to the earth. So there's lots of issues here that you could dive into. Entertainment, hobbies, and sex. Obviously, entertainment is a huge aspect in terms of what are the ethical considerations when it comes to entertainment and different aspects of immersive storytelling, and then the ethics around documentaries. I know Mandy Rose is here, has done a lot of work with the ethics of documentary and media production. But there's also just the creativity and the arts. But there's also like virtual violence and how much violence are you willing to have? What are the impacts of some of these different immersive experiences? What kind of trigger warnings do we need to have? What about the sexually explicit content? Obviously, VR pornography is a whole thing, but I think a concern here is preventing explicit content and the different moderation that you have to have. And I think that's for anybody that's doing user-generated content, they have to consider some of these aspects as well. So yeah, lots of different aspects here about the entertainment. Just in generally, what are the things, if you're in the entertainment industry, what other types of considerations should be thrown in here to this industry vertical? And then you have like the medicine and medical health. And I think this is interesting just because when I read through a lot of the ethical articles, you start to get into things like, what if you have a certain mental health condition? Are you more susceptible to having your agency undermined? Or if you have epilepsy, there could be specific things that are triggering you. Or if you have PTSD and other traumas, then there are medical connected issues that we may need to be aware of. And as we move forward, then what are those considerations for what kind of harm can be done from a medical perspective? But also just generally medicine within VR as a whole industry. So what are the ethics around do no harm when it comes to VR medicine and, being able to heal trauma and the implications of that. So lots in general around XR medicine. So this other partnerships, you have a dialectic between the self and the other. The other here could be everything from others that are hostile. So the degree to which that you have harassment within XR. I think this is for anybody that's doing a social VR application, you'll have to consider how do you deal with hostile people. You need to have blocking, you have personal space bubbles, you have all sorts of like best practices that have been emerging. If there's suspensions and blocking and how you deal with this harassment issue. If there's a cultural issue, to what degree can you technologically architect around it? There is also the empathy and truth and reconciliation. So to what degree are there ethical considerations around VR as an empathy machine has been quite a controversial in terms of, leading towards this technological determinism. What are the benefits and the risks there? That could be a part that is discussed here as well. I think there's lots of room for discussion around some of these things that have been talked about, but this could be an opportunity for folks to really okay, let's have this conversation that we've been avoiding. So yeah, like deep fakes in your own identity and trauma tourism and also virtual influencer AI beings and the risks there. Each of these contexts, there's so much stuff. This is certainly not a comprehensive thing. It's just trying to give you a flavor so that if you say, okay, here's something I have to contribute here, here's something I contribute here. So here we talk about death and grief rituals that are happening and how do we deal with death and grieving. Zoom funerals have been a big thing, but also bringing the dead back to life. There's ethical issues there around like trying to resurrect people through AI or through virtual reality, but Also just image rights, after people die, then what's it mean to be able to have your avatar representation represented after you die? There's also the whole area of the military in terms of like using extrajudicial military force to be able to actually use virtual reality robots or drones to be able to actually torture or kill people. So there's like different ethical issues. So experiential warfare and death and dying and violence, I think, could fit in here as well. So then philosophy, higher education, law. So this is an area where here we are, we're all talking about the ethics. There's going to be lots of different ethical approaches. And I think in the ethically aligned design, you have different traditions. And so what kind of lenses? We're going to have utilitarianism, deontology, or if there's going to be a contextual approach, looking at AI ethics and how we can learn from that. So just ethical approaches, and this is an opportunity for discussion about that. But also, there's a lot of academia in terms of the way that VR is breaking down all these academic disciplines and really trying to potentially take into consideration how VR is going to be used in some of these other academic disciplines as well. Just being able to comprehend complexity. And yeah, the filter bubbles of reality. What is truth? What is reality? I mean, there's so much rich philosophical questions about what VR introduces that, what type of content is illegal. And yeah, just a whole list of things here. Okay, so the last three, career, government, institutions. And so these are the ways in which that institutions are using VR, whether they're governments or private institutions, and enterprise applications. So that's like spatial design and architecture, or using virtual screens for production. But as an example, it could be like the Fourth Amendment. To what degree should the government have access to all of this information with the third-party doctrine? What are the future of public spaces when all of these private companies are owning these spaces? So what is a public space as we move forward into the metaverse? What if you have countries like China that are doing like loyalty tests, or the really Black Mirror-ish real negative potential of what VR could do? And algorithmic transparency in general, like being able to see what's actually behind a lot of these algorithms. And then friends, community, and the collective culture. So this is everything from the social gathering. I think there's a lot of different implications when you start to have groups of people together. How do you cultivate a culture within XR? This may be something that if you're just a software programmer, not all of a sudden you have to like learn how to cultivate and engineer culture, because you can only so limited with what you can do with technology. So these are things like the code of conduct and ways to be able to say, like, here are the rules for these environments, maybe doing a little review of some of the best practices, ways in which that you're hanging out with your friends, what are the different dilemmas that come up there, but also just generally like algorithmic bias. So when you talk about the collective culture, like who's being included, who's being excluded when it comes to creating these different algorithms and making sure you have a real diverse representation there. So that's a big issue here. And what are the normative standards and all these things of principles of diversity and inclusion? And social scores, I think, is another big thing. Like a lot of these applications are actually putting a score on you and your behavior. What if the government gets access to that? What are the implications of these social scores that are being implemented, and who has access to that? If the government has access to that, are we okay? If it's like an implicit area of trust. And then finally, you have all the ways that you're hidden, exiled, and different levels of accessibility. So this could be everything from banning or having temporary suspensions and putting people in like the virtual prison, or actually just prison rehabilitation. It's also combating isolation, as well as accessibility is a big issue here. This could be a whole chapter in its own right. What are the ethical considerations for how to do accessible design within XR? And yeah, I mean, this is like a rough taxonomy. As I've been doing interviews and issues come up, trying to put them in these different buckets. And as I read through things, I can sort them out. Whether or not we end up using this as a conceit to say, okay, these are the different chapters, it may end up being that in order to really robustly cover some of these issues, we have to kind of break them apart and see how they're in relationship to each other. I think that's the existential dilemma, which is that this is so vast and interconnected that these will end up showing up, a lot of these themes that I'm talking about, and how we decide how we're going to structure it. We may need to have like subcommittee members who are taking ownership of this and say, hey, I'm going to really be the facilitator. And hey, I know there's somebody who wasn't at this meeting who would be great, and they have a lot of great research. Let's see if they want to come in and start to collaborate on creating these different chapters. The XR Ethics Manifesto that I did was sort of like an initial survey. And really this group is to like put it into that next level of rigor, connecting to the research, having a deeper deliberative process, stress testing, seeing what's missing here, and just trying to be as comprehensive as we can. So again, the whole goal of what we're doing here is that us as the culture, the industry, and academia, we're coming together and we want to put together this white paper. We're trying to close the gap, the pacing gap the technological architecture and code is just zipping off. And this is our chance to say, hey, we're going to try to close this gap. So whatever effort we put forward is at least something that could inform other people as they put together the policy recommendations. And again, this is the rough timeline. We're here right now. I think the next step is to break up into these groups. We're going to have some sort of collaboration platform. It's not completely decided yet. It'll be maybe some sort of clone that looks something like Slack if it's not Slack, and maybe iMeet and other ways of like, what are ways that we can have high bandwidth conversations, these different channels, start to have the conversation after this. So we don't have that immediately ready, unfortunately, to say, hey, go get started right now. We still have to set it all up and figure out what the technology platform is that's all GDPR compliant. This in some sense is pushing the IEEE to evolve to be able to have the tools and technologies that they're going to be able to facilitate this type of collaborative process with all the people that are here and the people that are maybe watching this video afterwards to start to get involved. But this is the goal, within the next 6 months, we want to be able to, at the end, come together, start to write and iterate a few times and produce this white paper. So we need to split into the subcommittees. And if you're interested in like any of these and say, hey, I would really love to like head this up, or I think this could be a whole chapter in its own, the next big deadline I'm set is like about a month from now of March 5th, 2021, to have like a series of talks so that we could aim towards, okay, the next step is to just connect to each other and say, hey, I want to talk about this. And, to do a little bit more of a deeper dive, whether that's like all synchronous or asynchronous recorded, we'll have to sort of decide. Maybe we each record videos and we watch them and we all come together and have like a brainstorming session. But I'd like to just, before we start to get writing and stuff, let's just like talk to each other, connect to each other, have discussions. And then from there, the first draft due by like the end of April. So that's about 12 weeks from now to be able to actually like consolidate what I just gave you here as a big overview into like the first draft. And then we can kind of iterate from there for the end of July. And if you are interested in collaboration, what we're asking you to do is to send an email to this email address at xr-ethics@ieee.org. Overall, we're trying to be pretty open, but also have at least some ways in which that you can get onboarded into this. To go from this meeting, you all made it here, so congratulations for making it here and participating in this meeting here. But to take it to the next step and say, hey, you know what, I'm actually interested in producing and collaborating and just being a part of the discussion. And then we'll be able to add you to that platform once all that is set up. And I think with that, again, my name's Kent Bai, I do the Voices of VR. I'll sort of hand it back to the rest of the committee to be able to further discuss and answer any questions.